Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where the hidden stories of America's past come to life. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a journey into our nation's forgotten history. Now, let you step back in time to the very first light of freedom, carried not only by the famous, but by countless forgotten American heroes whose courage shaped the birth of a nation. Asterisk, the story of America's freedom often begins with famous names. Washington crossing the Delaware, Jefferson drafting his Declaration, Franklin with his wit and lightning rod. But beneath the weight of those monuments, there are shadows of men and women whose names the textbooks forgot, though their blood was spilled in the same soil, and their courage burned just as bright. This is their story. It begins not with cannons or speeches, but with the soft crackle of firelight in a tavern, a plow scratching through stubborn earth, the steady thump of a hammer in a blacksmith's forge. America, before freedom, was a patchwork of lives lived quietly. Farmers tilled the ground. Mothers stitched clothes by candlelight. Children fetched water from wells. The colonies were rough, simple, but alive with hope. And in the quiet corners of these towns, men and women felt the rumble of something larger than themselves. They sensed that freedom was not yet born, but it was stirring. In Massachusetts, there was a farmer named Elias Carter. His fields stretched along the edge of Concord, rows of corn and rye that bent under the summer winds. Elias was no soldier. He was a man of the soil, his hands hardened, his back bent from years of harvests. Yet when word spread that the king's men would march to seize the colonists' weapons, Elias left his plow where it stood. He kissed his wife, handed his oldest son the reins of the farm, and shouldered a musket older than himself. He marched into history, though no monument bears his name. Elias stood on that April morning in 1775, when the first shots cracked across Lexington Green. Smoke drifted low, and fear gripped the hearts of men who had never killed before. But Elias did not step back. He fired once, then again, his heart pounding with the knowledge that life as he knew it had ended. For him, freedom was not an idea polished in books. It was the hope that his children would never bow their heads to a crown. Across the ocean, others stood with him, ordinary men with names lost to time. A tailor who stitched clothes by lantern light. A miller who ground grain into flour for neighbors. A schoolteacher who carried his Bible in one pocket and powder in the other. Their courage was quiet, but it was the kind that built a nation. In Virginia, along the rolling hills, there was Mary Caldwell. She never carried a musket, but her role was no less dangerous. Mary's husband was away, serving with Washington's militia. Alone, she ran the farm, fed her children, and sent food secretly to the troops. When redcoats came knocking, demanding loyalty, she lied with steady eyes, swearing she had nothing to give. Yet by night, she hid supplies beneath barrels of grain, driving them by wagon to the camps. Once, caught on a lonely road, she faced a British officer. "This is for my children," she said, her voice strong as she refused to yield her wagon. They let her pass. History did not remember Mary's name, but freedom would not have survived without her. There was also a boy, Jacob Reed, barely 16 when war broke out. He was too young to vote, too young to own land, but not too young to carry a drum. He beat the rhythm that held men steady as they marched into fire. At Brandywine, Jacob's drum was shattered by a musket ball. He picked up another and kept drumming. When his regiment faltered, he lifted the fallen flag, though it was taller than himself, and carried it forward until smoke blinded him. He did not live past that day. His body lay among hundreds, but for those who survived, the image of a boy. Carrying their flag lived forever in their hearts. Freedom's first light was not only lit on battlefields. In workshops, along rivers, in homes, unseen hands carried the flame. A blacksmith in Pennsylvania, Samuel Hart, forged more than horseshoes. He crafted gun barrels by night, slipping them into wagons bound for the Continental Army. He was never paid, never praised. When illness took him, his neighbors remembered. Only that his hammer never ceased, even when his own body gave way. And let us not forget the enslaved men and women who longed for liberty, though America's promise did not yet reach them. Some fought in hopes of freedom, trading their chains for muskets. One such man was Josiah, a slave in Virginia who escaped to fight with the Patriots. He stood in ragged clothes beside white farmers, muskets in hand, knowing the war might free him or return him to bondage. At Yorktown, Josiah was struck down by grapeshot. He died never seeing liberty, yet his blood mingled with theirs, a sacrifice unmarked by marble or bronze. This, too, was freedom's first light, fragile, uneven, incomplete, but burning nonetheless. Through the long winters, heroes endured where memory faltered. At Valley Forge, men wrapped their feet in rags, teeth chattering, ribs showing beneath torn coats. They drilled on frozen ground until the skin of their hands split open. One soldier, Daniel Price, wrote a final letter to his wife. "If I fall, tell our children that I died, hoping they might stand tall in a land of their own." Daniel did fall during a skirmish the world has long forgotten. His children grew in freedom, though they never knew where his bones lay. When we think of America's birth, we see flags waving, cannons roaring, declarations written in bold ink. But the truth is softer and harder. It was 1,000 nameless sacrifices: the mother hiding cornmeal, the boy carrying a drum, the blacksmith's aching arms, the farmer leaving his plow. Their stories, though forgotten, are the bedrock of the nation. And as dawn broke over the new republic, it was not only the famous who brought the light of freedom, but these quiet souls, scattered in towns and fields, who gave their last breath so that liberty might live. They deserve to be remembered. Their courage should not be lost to the dust of history. For in their forgotten names, we find the true spirit of America, not in crowns or titles, but in ordinary people who dared to stand against the impossible. The Revolution was not only fought with muskets and cannons. It was fought with whispers, hidden notes, false smiles, and courage that moved quietly through the shadows. For every soldier who raised a weapon, there were others who risked their lives in silent spies, messengers, mothers, fathers, children, all who understood that winning freedom meant outlasting fear. The year was 1776. The Declaration had been signed. The ink bold and defiant, yet on the battlefields, defeat loomed heavy. Washington's army had been pushed from New York. Confidence faltered. In taverns and homes, whispers began. Perhaps the cause was already lost. It was in this dark season that ordinary men and women stepped forward, not with glory awaiting them, but with danger that could end their lives in a noose. One such hero was Nathan Hawley. His name is remembered in a single sentence: "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." Yet beyond those words lies the truth of his sacrifice. Hawley was a young school teacher from Connecticut, gentle and soft-spoken, who volunteered to spy for Washington. He slipped into British-held New York, disguised as a Dutch schoolmaster. But spies were not given the honor of soldiers. If caught, they were treated as criminals, strung up without mercy. When Hawley was discovered, he faced death not as a celebrated hero, but as a condemned traitor in British eyes. Tied beneath the gallows, he asked for a Bible. They denied him. He asked for a minister. They refused. Still, as the rope tightened, he gave words that burned into memory. His only regret was that he had but one life to give. But Nathan Hawley was not alone. There were many more unknown, unspoken, who spied, carried secret letters, and passed false information. Take the Culper ring, a network of ordinary people in Long Island and New York who fed intelligence to Washington. Anna Strong, a farmer's wife, hung laundry on a clothesline in coded patterns to signal fellow spies. A black petticoat meant one thing. Handkerchiefs placed just so meant another. Neighbors saw nothing more than a woman's wash drying in the breeze. In truth, she was guiding men who carried intelligence that might save the army from destruction. Robert Townsend, another member of the Culper Ring, worked as a merchant. Outwardly loyal to the crown, he listened carefully in taverns and offices, noting every scrap of information the British officers let slip. He wrote in invisible ink between the lines of business letters, messages that traveled across enemy lines to reach Washington. Townsend never spoke of his work, not even to his family. For decades after the war, his role remained a secret, his heroism buried until long after his death. Then there was Hercules Mulligan, a tailor in New York. Customers came to him for coats and uniforms, British officers, wealthy loyalists, men, who never guessed that the hands measuring their shoulders and stitching their cuffs belonged to a Patriot spy. Mulligan listened as they boasted of troop movements or supply shortages. He slipped the information to Washington, saving lives and battles. Yet his neighbors often mistrusted him, seeing only a man friendly with the enemy. He bore their suspicion in silence, knowing that secrecy was the price of freedom. But the war was not only fought by spies in cities. On lonely roads and across farmlands, couriers risked everything to carry messages. A boy named William Hunter, only 15, rode miles through enemy-held territory with dispatches hidden in his saddle. Once caught by British patrols, he swallowed a paper whole before they could seize it. They beat him and left him half dead, but William survived. He limped home, his body broken, but his spirit unbent. And then there were the women, so many forgotten, so many overlooked. Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts refused to sit quietly while men carried the fight. Disguising herself as a man, she bound her chest, donned a uniform, and enlisted under the name Robert Shirtliff. She marched, fought, and bled beside other soldiers for nearly 2 years. Wounded in battle, she dug a musket ball from her own thigh with a penknife rather than be discovered by an army surgeon. For years, no one knew the truth. Only when sickness forced her into care was her secret revealed. She had fought as bravely as any man, and far more bravely than many. Some women fought not with muskets, but with fire and grit. At the Battle of Monmouth, when men fell from heat and exhaustion, Mary Ludwig Hayes, known as Molly Pitcher, took her husband's place at the cannon. She rammed powder, loaded shot, and fired into the enemy ranks, while smoke blackened her face and bullets tore the ground around her. When her husband collapsed, she carried water for the wounded, her courage burning as bright as the cannon's flash. But beyond the known names were thousands more, whose stories were whispered in kitchens or buried with their bodies. A widow in New Jersey, known only in records as Mrs. T, opened her home to Continental soldiers fleeing British patrols. When enemy troops searched her property, she hid men in her cellar, standing above the trapdoor with a basket of laundry, her heart pounding as boots struck the floorboards. They never discovered the men beneath her feet. On the southern frontier, war was even harsher. Guerrilla fighters, farmers, hunters, and woodsmen rose up against British forces and their loyalist allies. Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, is remembered, but behind him were dozens of nameless fighters who struck from shadows and melted into the swamps. One such man, Elijah Middleton, a poor trapper, guided Marion's men through tangled marshes, risking capture daily. He never lived to see the war's end, cut down by loyalists in his skirmish no-book records. His grave lies unmarked, swallowed by reeds, yet his courage shaped the South's resistance. Not all heroes held weapons. Some fought with words, with paper, with songs that lifted weary souls. In Philadelphia, a printer named Mary Catherine Goddard set type by hand to publish the very first printed copy of the Declaration of Independence that bore the names of its signers. At a time when printing that document meant risking death for treason, she pressed each sheet, ink staining her fingers with defiance. Later, she would lose her post under pressure from political men who claimed a woman could not hold authority. Yet she never bowed, never regretted the danger she had embraced. And then there were the forgotten voices of those bound in slavery. The war promised freedom to some, but betrayed many more. The British, seeking to weaken the colonies, offered liberty to enslaved men who fled their patriot masters. Thousands escaped, joining British lines, their names lost in records. Yet others fought for the American cause, clinging to the hope that the words "all men are created equal" might someday be true. One such man was Salem Poor, who purchased his own freedom and fought at Bunker Hill. His bravery was so striking that 14 officers petitioned Congress to recognize him for his valor. Yet history tucked his name into the margins, leaving his story unsung by generations. In the backcountry of Georgia, another enslaved man, known only as Austin, saved the life of his master, a Patriot colonel, by warning him of an ambush. Austin could have run, could have sought freedom in the chaos of war, but he chose loyalty in that moment. The colonel lived, the ambush failed, but Austin's name was lost. Only scraps of record remind us of the life he risked and the freedom he was denied. Children, too, bore the weight of war. 10-year-old Sybil Ludington, the daughter of a colonel in New York, rode through the night to rally militia forces when the British advanced. Alone in the dark, she covered nearly 40 miles through rain and mud, warning scattered farms and villages. Her ride was twice as long as Paul Revere's, yet her name rarely echoes in classrooms. By dawn, her clothes were soaked, her body exhausted, but hundreds of men had answered her call. Freedom's first light shone not only on battlefields, but in these countless acts of bravery, some loud, some silent. Each was a thread in the fabric of revolution, woven by hands that history rarely bothered to record. And yet, in every act, there was risk. For those who fought openly, capture meant bayonets or the musket's blast. For those who fought in shadows, discovery meant the hangman's rope, the torch set to their homes, their families punished in their stead. They carried that fear daily, yet pressed on. The revolution was not a war won by great men alone. It was a war carried on the backs of thousands spies in taverns, farmers in fields, mothers on lonely roads, children in the night. And though history has forgotten their names, their courage was real, their sacrifices unshakable. As the war dragged on, the nation's survival hung by a thread. But again and again, it was these forgotten heroes who tied that thread, holding the dream of liberty together until dawn finally came. By 1777, the revolution had ground into a war of endurance. Victories were rare, and defeats were heavy. For every triumph like Saratoga, there were losses that left fields scattered with broken muskets and unmarked graves. The dream of liberty flickered in the wind, and it seemed only a matter of time before the crown snuffed it out. It was in these darkest hours that the forgotten heroes rose tallest. Take the winter at Valley Forge. In 1777–78, history remembers Washington standing solemn against the snow, his men gaunt and starving. But behind that image were the names lost to time soldiers, wives, children facing cold so bitter it split their skin. One such man was Private Isaac Lowell from New Hampshire. He had been a farmer, his only wealth a few acres of rocky soil and a pair of oxen. He left his wife and 2 daughters to join the fight. At Valley Forge, he wrote one final letter, though it never reached home. He described wrapping his feet in rags stiff with ice, sharing scraps of bread hard as stone, watching friends collapse into shallow graves dug in frozen earth. He ended his letter with one line: "Tell the girls their father froze for their freedom." Isaac died before spring, but his sacrifice, like thousands of others, bought time for the army to endure. Not all at Valley Forge carried muskets. Wives followed their husbands into camp, washing clothes, tending fires, nursing the sick. Among them was Sarah Osborne, who cooked for the soldiers, feeding them thin stews from what little could be gathered. She lifted spirits with hymns sung softly at night, her voice rising through the whistling wind. She never fired a shot, but without women like Sarah, the army might not have survived to fight again. And then there were the enslaved men who endured double chains, bound by both frost and bondage. James Armistead, a Virginia slave, entered history not through gunfire, but through deception. He volunteered to serve the British as a loyalist spy, gaining the trust of General Cornwallis himself. Yet James was a double agent. Every word he overheard in British camps, every plan whispered over maps, he carried back to the Americans. His intelligence would later prove vital at Yorktown. But when victory came, James returned not to freedom, but to slavery. Only years later was he granted liberty, taking the name James Armistead Lafayette in honor of the French general who vouched for him. His heroism nearly disappeared beneath the weight of a system that refused to see him as a man. While Valley Forge groaned under snow, the northern frontier faced its own nightmare. At Wyoming, Pennsylvania, in 1778, a small band of settlers, farmers, millers, mothers faced an onslaught of British soldiers and their Iroquois allies. Outnumbered and outmatched, they fought desperately to defend their homes. One woman, known in records only as Widow Skinner, loaded muskets as fast as trembling hands would allow, pressing them into the arms of the men. When the line collapsed, she fled with her children through burning fields, carrying a baby against her chest, another clinging to her skirts. She survived, but hundreds of her neighbors did not. Her story, like so many, lingers in fragments, yet her courage shines through the smoke of tragedy. Farther south, the Carolinas boiled with partisan warfare. The British held towns and strongholds, but the countryside burned with resistance. Men like Thomas Sumter, Andrew Pickens, and Francis Marion became legends, yet they did not fight alone. Behind them were poor farmers, trappers, and frontiersmen who had little to lose but their lives. One such man was John Collins, a hunter from the backwoods of South Carolina. He fought with Marion's band, striking at British patrols, vanishing into the swamps. Once, captured and bound, he was offered his life in exchange for betraying his comrades. John spat in the officer's face. He was hanged from a tree at dawn. His name never reached the newspapers, but in the whispers of the swamp, he was remembered as a man who would not bend dot. Not all resistance came from the frontier. In cities, merchants and artisans took risks that cut just as deep. In Boston, printers smuggled Patriot papers beneath shipments of cloth. In Philadelphia, dock workers passed supplies under the noses of British patrols. In Charleston, women gathered intelligence at lavish dinners, sipping wine while listening closely to British officers who underestimated them. One such woman, Rebecca Bruton Mott, later set fire to her own home, a grand plantation house seized by the British and fortified as a garrison. Rather than see her property in enemy hands, she provided flaming arrows to Patriot forces, watching her house blaze as redcoats scrambled out. Few women in history have sacrificed so willingly, so completely for the cause. The war did not spare children either. They carried powder horns, drove wagons, and acted as messengers. At the Battle of Cowpens in 1781, a boy named Thomas Young, just 16, fought alongside hardened militia. He later recalled the chaos, The thunder of muskets, the screams of horses, the smoke choking the air. Wounded twice, he refused to leave the field. "I was but a boy," he later wrote, "yet I fought as a man." His wounds scarred him for life, yet his bravery helped turn the tide in one of the South's most decisive battles. While battles raged, ordinary families endured hunger, fire, and fear. Homes were burned, fields stripped, livestock stolen. A woman in New Jersey, Abigail Dickinson, kept her children alive through a winter when British foragers had taken every scrap of food. She boiled leather scraps into broth, feeding her family spoonfuls of bitter liquid. Years later, her son would say, "We ate freedom before we tasted it." These are the stories that rarely appear in history books, not because they were unimportant, but because they belonged to the nameless many rather than the famous few. Yet their sacrifices were the lifeblood of the Revolution, and as the war stretched into years, it was these forgotten heroes who sustained the dream. Without them, there would have been no victory at Saratoga, no endurance at Valley Forge, no triumph at Yorktown. Still, freedom's light flickered uncertainly. Every life lost dimmed it, every defeat threatened to snuff it out. But again and again, the nameless and the forgotten bent low, shielding the fragile flame with their bodies, their courage. Their last breaths by 1781, as the war drew toward its climax, the nation's hope rested not on declarations or speeches, but on the shoulders of thousands who would never see their names carved into marble. They marched, they starved, they fought, and they died, believing in a dream they would never live to enjoy. And when the end finally came, it was not only the generals who brought victory, but the countless forgotten souls who carried freedom's first light through the darkest night. The year was 1781. 6 long years had passed since the first shots cracked across Lexington and Concord. 6 years of smoke, hunger, mud, and graves. The dream of freedom had been tested in every valley and on every field, and yet, against all odds, the flames still burned. The war's turning point came in the South. Cornwallis, Britain's proud general, believed he could crush the rebellion by sweeping through Virginia. His redcoats marched with drums beating, confident that the ragged Colonials could not endure. Yet he did not reckon with the spirit of a people who had already given everything. The final chapter came at Yorktown. Washington and his French allies moved swiftly, boxing Cornwallis in against the York River. Cannons thundered night after night, their roar shaking the ground, their smoke blotting out the stars. Soldiers dug trenches under fire, hauling earth with blistered hands, while sharpshooters picked at them from the walls. It was a siege that tested courage not in moments, but in endless hours. Among those digging was a man named Joseph Plum Martin, a young private who later wrote his memories. He recalled carrying heavy fascines, bundles of sticks to build walls while musket balls whistled past. He remembered the fear, the hunger, the exhaustion, but also the strange pride of standing firm when every instinct screamed to run. Martin was one of the few common soldiers whose words survived. But around him, thousands of others fought nameless, voiceless, their courage buried in silence. One of the most daring moments came when Washington ordered the assault on British redoubts, fortified positions bristling with guns. It was a nighttime attack, carried out with bayonets in hand and courage in heart. Among the storming party were men who history never bothered to name: farm boys, fishermen, clerks, and freedmen. In the darkness, they charged through gunfire, climbing walls slick with blood and rain, planting the American flag above captured works. Victory was not claimed by generals alone, but by these ordinary men who clawed freedom out of the earth with their bare hands. There was also James Armistead, the enslaved double agent who had slipped into Cornwallis's confidence. The intelligence he gathered had helped Washington corner the British at Yorktown. While Cornwallis stewed in frustration, James walked freely in camp, carrying secrets back to the Americans. Yet when the British surrendered, James was still a slave. The nation had been born, but its promise had not yet reached him. It would take years, petitions, and the testimony of the Marquis de Lafayette before James finally received his freedom. His sacrifice might have been forgotten entirely, had not his persistence carried his name into the light dot as Cornwallis's drums beat the slow march of surrender. Thousands of anonymous patriots stood and watched. They had no medals, no speeches, no songs. Some would limp home to ruined farms, others to widows waiting at doorsteps, others to graves dug by neighbors. The revolution had ended, but their lives were marked forever. And then there were those who had given everything with no return. Fields across the colonies held their bones at Bunker Hill, Brandywine, Camden, and countless nameless skirmishes. Mothers buried sons in shallow ground. Wives bore children who would never know their fathers. Their sacrifice was the price of liberty, paid in full, yet their names dissolved like mist. The war was over. A new nation stood trembling, fragile, uncertain. The famous men, the Washingtons, the Jeffersons, the Franklins, took their place in the pages of history. But the true foundation of the United States was not only laid by them, it was laid by Elias Carter, the farmer who left his plow at Concord, by Mary Caldwell, who drove her wagon past British soldiers to feed the hungry, by Jacob Reed, the boy whose drumbeat carried men into battle, by Sarah Osborne, who ladled thin soup into frozen hands at Valley Forge, by John Collins, who swung from a tree rather than betray his comrades, by Sybil Luddington, who rode through rain and fear to wake the militia, by James Armistead, who carried secrets that ended the war, though freedom was denied him. They were not remembered in statues. Their faces do not hang in oil portraits. Their names rarely appear in books. But their courage, their sacrifices, their stubborn endurance, that was the true fire of freedom's first light. And now, 2 centuries later, we walk upon the soil they defended. We speak words they dreamed of but never heard. Liberty, equality, independence. We live in the shadow of their sacrifices. Even if we do not know their names, history often crowns the generals and statesmen, but the soul of America lives in its forgotten heroes. In the farmer who shouldered a musket, though he could barely feed his children. In the mother who hid rebels in her cellar while enemy boots thundered overhead. In the boy who carried powder, the woman who carried water, the slave who carried intelligence, the widow who carried on when all was lost. Their gift was not glory. Their gift was freedom. And so, as we remember the dawn of this nation, let us not only speak of the men in marble halls, but of the countless ordinary souls who fought, bled, and died for a dream larger than themselves. They are America's truest story. They are freedom's first light. May we never forget them.